Hello, everyone, and welcome to Attitude Magazine's ADHD Experts broadcast. We are pleased to have Dr. Rachel Schwartz here to talk about successful strategies for creating a behavior plan for school. Before we get started, let me attend to a couple of housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive around an hour after the live broadcast. For those of you listening in replay or podcast mode, please visit the webinar replay page on the Attitude website, www.attitudemag.com/podcast-330/, for access to both the accompanying slides and the Certificate of Attendance option. Now for today's topic, improving behavior at school. Is your child disruptive in the classroom, whether being taught virtually or physically? As an educator, do you correct or punish the same student repeatedly? Too often, parents and educators are burned out and frustrated by a student's interfering behaviors, which can cause school exclusion and reduce social and academic opportunities. Better behavior doesn't always happen quickly or easily, but a comprehensive positive behavior support plan, PBSP, provides the starting point for constructive behavior change. Dr. Schwartz will tell us how to create a behavior plan and how to maximize its use. Dr. Schwartz has worked internationally, creating and supervising programs for individuals with developmental disabilities. She has published original research on these topics in journals such as Career Development and Transition for Exceptional Individuals and Remedial and Special Education. She has presented at national, state, and local conferences. Rachel currently serves as an educational consultant and trainer with the Watson Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You can ask questions of Dr. Schwartz during her presentation, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can after she finishes. That all being said, I'll turn it over to Rachel. Thanks so much for being here today. And I'm sure everyone else is looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Wayne. I'm happy to be here today and to talk to you guys about one of my favorite topics, which is behavior support plans. Some of you might be wondering, what is the problem with behavior plans? Why are we taking time to talk about this? And I'm glad you are asking that question, because the problem is that problem behavior often results in more restrictive settings for individuals in special education. It increases teacher burnout, and it results in communication breakdowns and a lack of trust between the student, the school, and the family. So today I want to present some considerations for the behavior plan and ways to ensure that you are creating and advocating for a solid and comprehensive plan for your students or your child. Let's first come together about what is behavior. We say the word behavior a lot in education and even in our day-to-day. The child engaged in a behavior when you have a behavior, but I don't think we often stop to think about or to consider what the word behavior means. Behavior is everything that we do. You engage in behaviors all day. You're walking, you're sitting, you're listening, you're shuffling around. All of those are behaviors. If you aren't engaging in a behavior, you are no longer with us. There are a few other important assumptions about behavior. I mentioned these at the last webinar, but I'm going to quickly review them now. All behavior is learned. We learn to behave in a way that works for us, that gets us what we need or what we want. When you're hungry, you get up, you go to the fridge. When you're tired, you behave in a way that gets you ready for bed. The second assumption is that behavior is determined by its context. We learn how to behave differently based on our environment. How you behave in a library is different than how you behave at a basketball game. This is very important to consider when there are significant behavioral differences between home and school environments. So the kid you see at home may not be the kid that they see at school, or vice versa. The last assumption is that all behavior is used to accomplish something. It is functional. We engage in behaviors to get our needs met. We eat when we feel hungry. We sleep when we are tired. We're lonely, you go talk to someone. We don't like something, we get away from it. we engage in a series of behaviors to get those needs met. And this is perhaps the most important part of behavioral programming. It's something that I really want to sink in when we're talking about behavior. Problem behavior doesn't occur because a kid just doesn't like you or a kid is lazy. Problem behavior occurs because it is serving a purpose for the child. For those of you who saw my FBA webinar, you'll recognize this slide. When we say challenging behaviors, we mean that these behaviors are significant enough that they are affecting a student or other students' abilities to learn or to interact in the classroom or the school environment. So within IDEA, it states when a behavior impedes when a student's learning or the learning of others, at this point, an FBA should be requested. So that functional behavior assessment should be requested. Now, some schools may request an IEP meeting and say, hey, I'd like to see if we can add in some extra breaks or teacher check-ins throughout the day and see if that helps before doing that full FBA. I would say that this varies by the school and the severity of the behavior. At the very least, if a student is demonstrating challenging behavior that is impeding with his learning or the learning of others, the IEP or 504 team needs to meet to discuss the potential for the FBA, or if there are some other changes or tweaks to the current plan that they want to trial first. If you do decide to trial a few changes, ensure that you have a data collection process in place to monitor if progress is made and if those are effective. Now, I would say a majority of teams go straight to that functional behavior assessment. The purpose of that FBA is to assess what are the variables surrounding the problem behavior, why is the student engaging in the problem behavior, and what are some potential recommendations to help improve the behavior and teach new skills. You do not need to have an IEP or a 504 plan to receive a behavior plan or request for an FBA. An FBA should be conducted if any student is struggling behaviorally in the school environment. This is taken from the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports website, PBIS, and I think it's a really nice visual to discuss how a student gets a behavior plan. So many schools follow this sort of framework for problem behaviors. Some officially use school-wide PBIS, and others develop similar types of systems within their own school district. Essentially, you have all students served at Tier 1, which is by the school-wide rules and their policies, and their supports that are in place to practice and reinforce those behaviors. Now, some kids still struggle to engage in appropriate behaviors, even with those Tier 1 supports. And so for these students, the team comes together to say, hey, we need to give this kid a little something extra. This may mean taking a look at those IEP and 504 plans, if the student has them, to ensure that they have adequate academic and social emotional supports. And at this point, you add in some additional supports, but there's not a full plan. You just do a little bit of tweaks. Now, if the student is still struggling or has not made the gains anticipated, then they move up to needing a more intensive support. So that's that Tier 3 level, and that's where you are looking at a behavior plan. An FBA is conducted, if it wasn't already conducted there at Tier 2, and you are looking to develop a full intervention plan. So as I said, not all school districts use this exact system, but in general, many follow a similar type of model. They might have 4 tiers or 5, it depends, but they always follow some kind of model of how to address and how to start figuring out who needs additional supports. I reviewed the FBAs in a prior webinar, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on how to conduct them here. However, it's really important to touch on because it's essential to that process. So the purpose of an FBA is to answer these 2 questions. Why does the student engage in interfering behavior? And what can we do to reduce those interfering behaviors to increase the appropriate behaviors? Here's the process. So the first is you start with the definition of the disruptive behavior. Then you usually collect some indirect data. So that includes reviewing prior behavior plans and education plans. And this stage also typically involves interviewing stakeholders. So that could be parents, that could be teachers, paraprofessionals, anyone who's involved. Then you have the direct observation. So whoever is conducting the assessment will directly observe the student multiple times, at least 3, usually between 3 and 5, in order to get a sense of what is going on and to collect some of the quantitative data. So that's that frequency, duration, whatever it is, whatever dimension makes sense for the behavior. And then the next stage might include a functional analysis, which is a testing of different potential functions, a preference assessment to identify preferred items, and a reinforcer assessment to determine if any of those items are actually reinforcers. And then lastly, whoever conducts the assessment writes everything up in a report with an analysis of the data and some corresponding recommendations. The FBA is not a traditional school assessment. You don't ask the student to perform a series of tasks. It is all about understanding the individual child and what is going on in their environment, their responses, their individual characteristics. It is not about a diagnosis. It is not about figuring out if your kid has autism or how the characteristics of ADHD might be affecting their behaviors. Honestly, I never focus on the diagnosis when I'm conducting FBAs. I focus on the individual student, what they are doing, what they're saying, how they are interacting with others, and their individualized learning history. In other words, the focus should always be on the behavior and not on the label or the diagnosis. Now let's jump into this behavior support plan. So the behavior plan, behavior intervention plan, positive behavior support plan, whatever you call it, there's a lot of different acronyms. They're all the same thing. This happens after the completion of an FBA. So if there is not an FBA prior to the completion of a positive behavior support plan, that's a huge red flag for you. The behavior plan is a formal document that outlines the problem behavior, the hypothesis of why the behavior is occurring, and interventions to replace and reduce the interfering behavior. It will also outline and measurable behavioral goals and way to teach and reinforce those new skills. Every IEP has a section that says something along the lines of, does their student have any behaviors that are interfering with their learning? Something along those lines. And if you check yes, then that means that you need a positive behavior support plan. Your child needs a positive behavior support plan. Your student needs a plan. It is extremely important to understand that the behavior support plan is a teaching plan. What to teach the student so the problem behavior goes away. Problem behavior indicates skill deficits. And so the purpose of the positive behavior support plan is to teach new and appropriate skills. We can't just take away a problem behavior and not replace it with a new behavior. And ideally, you want to replace it with a ton of new behaviors. So we are building the repertoire of a student and they are becoming more competent and more confident in all of their skills. So outlined here is what you should expect to see in a comprehensive behavior support plan. We're going to go through each of these sections. You should have the definition of the problem behavior, including the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence, and the hypothesized function. You should see a behavior goal, which lists a replacement behavior or behaviors and how those behaviors will be measured. And then you should have a teaching section. What changes will be made to the environment, if any, to the teacher and the student interactions? How will the new behavior be prompted and taught? And what will the consequences be for using the new behavior and engaging in the problem behavior? Every behavior support plan looks different, so it's not going to look the way I have it laid out here, but you should be able to find this information in the document. If you are the one writing the document, you need to think about how you can include all of these different pieces in there. Let's start with the beginning of the behavior plan, which should outline the direct antecedents, the consequences, and the hypothesized function. This should be taken directly from the FBA. The antecedent, that part, is what consistently occurs directly before the problem behavior. This isn't guesswork. This has already been collected and analyzed within the FBA. The antecedent should list predictable events that always happen right before that interfering behavior. It could be an instruction to start class. It could be a transition, switching from a preferred activity to a non-preferred. If you want to double check, go back and look at the FBA, especially that data in the FBA, and ensure that those two sections align. The next section is the behavior itself. So here you are looking for an objective definition of behavior, not just noncompliance or controlling, but something that has movement, hitting head, throwing desk, something that's an action. The next part is the consequence. Similar to the antecedent, this is taken directly from the FBA. This is what typically happens to or with the student immediately after the problem behavior. I often see this section completed incorrectly. The consequence should be listing only the common occurrences that happen right after the problem behavior. So that might be teacher says no, teacher provides a verbal redirection, student runs out of the classroom, student screams no, and punches his buddy John. These are statements on what occurs, not an analysis on why it is occurring. That why section is saved for the function. This means what is the hypothesized purpose for the problem behavior. And I say hypothesized because we don't live in someone else's head, so we can only guess as to why they are doing something based on the data that we have. This will also be taken directly from that FBA. The typical functions that you see, and I'll tell you right now, it's usually not just one thing. If someone says, oh, they're only doing it for attention, I would say there's probably a couple more pieces involved. Not all the time, but usually. But the typical functions are to escape something or someone, gain access to something or someone, delay something, gain attention, or for automatic or self-stimulatory reasons. So that's more of the stereotypy that you might see with some students. The next section should have something about a behavior goal. As I stated before, the purpose of this positive behavior support plan is not just to decrease a behavior, but to teach a new behavior. In fact, teaching is the most important part of the plan. So here you should see a skill or skills that the teacher is going to teach. In addition, the replacement behavior or skill must match that function we just talked about. That is vital and a very, very common mistake to have those not align. So for example, if the function is, let's say they say it's to escape and gain attention, then that replacement behavior or behaviors should be asking for a break with a teacher or peer, something that results in that same function or functions being met. So in that case, it would be attention and escape. The replacement behavior must be easier or less effortful than the problem behavior. So if a child has to go through a series of steps in order to get teacher attention, he might as well keep throwing himself on the floor because that's easier for him. And it's going to be more quick attention for doing that than for sitting, waiting 5 seconds, and then raising his hand. So that's another huge consideration. We have to make sure the replacement skill is easier for the student than the problem behavior and more effective or efficient for the student. Another consideration with that replacement behavior is to think beyond the target behavior itself. What skills does the student currently have? What do they need? What do they like? There's a lot of information that needs to be considered with that replacement behavior. And here you will also see some sort of measurement associated with the goal. What is the target we are reaching here? Do we want them to go from a rate of 20% of intervals to 60%, 80%? Do you want to go from doing it once out of every 10 opportunities to 10 out of 10 opportunities? The common mistake I see here is people often write the measurement in a way that is not really feasible or practical with the goal. For example, I'll see something like, John will ask for help with 90% accuracy across 9 out of 10 trials. Now, if you are in a school setting, it is rare that you are running trials on asking for help. Not to say that you won't be or that wouldn't happen. You could be teaching this one-on-one in a discrete trial format, and that trials make sense. But often, these are default goals that don't really quite align with the skill you are teaching. So I would take a close look at those goals and really ask, how is this going to be measured? Often measurement can occur just through a simple data sheet. Did this occur or didn't this occur? And there might be a time component. Maybe did this occur within 10 seconds of an instruction, or did it not occur? If no one can tell you how it will be measured and you as the teacher struggle to measure it, it isn't really a great goal. The goal should also take into account that student's present level of performance, as we sort of mentioned above, and needs to be reasonable and realistic to their baseline. You can't ask a student to sit in class for 30 minutes if right now they can only demonstrate they can sit in class for 1. We have to be realistic of where they are. Now, the next part isn't ever labeled as a teaching section, but that's how I like to describe it. After you summarize the FBA in that ABC section, after you have a measurable goal, the PBSP should then go on to describe in some way how the student is going to be taught those skills. You might not have all of these components, but these are some areas of you should consider including in here. So the first is the environment. This would include some antecedent strategies such as preferred seating, use of a visual schedule or cues, something along those lines. And then you have the teacher and the student interactions. These reference strategies that the teacher will use in how they communicate and how they interact with the student. So this might mean getting down to the student's level, pausing after a directive for a certain amount of time, keeping voice low and calm versus raising their voice. The next part is how the new behavior will be taught and prompted. This usually goes under a replacement behavior section or something similar. Here is where you are looking for explanations on how your child or student will learn those replacement skills. If the replacement skill, let's say, is coping skills, how will they learn those? With who? Where? This level of explanation usually is left out of plans, and it is very important for you as a parent and you as an educator to have an explicit plan as to how you are going to teach this skill. It isn't just, I want this kid to decrease their frustration, so I'm going to make a goal that he takes a break and learns to take deep breaths. It isn't enough just to say it and to write it. We have to teach it. You should be looking for some sort of explanation or outline as to how those skills are going to be taught, some kind of systematic prompting system. There will also be a consequence section. And in this section, you should have an explanation of what you as the educator will do after the student uses the replacement skills, and then what happens after the student engages in the problem behavior. I've often seen this written as a bullet point section. It might be written as a flow chart, step by step. First, we'll prompt him to use his communication device, and then we'll model the skills. It doesn't really matter how you write it as long as you write it down and that's in the plan. A couple of points here too. You will always see the phrase, we will reinforce the student. How? Parents, ask specifically how they will be reinforced for using the appropriate skills. Educators, make sure you know how the student will be reinforced. The reinforcement should relate to the function of the behavior, what we talked about at the beginning. For example, if the function, let's say, is escape from the task demand, the reinforcement should be immediate escape. If the reinforcement is verbal praise, ensure that verbal praise is actually reinforcing for a student. Educators, I would really encourage you to include a preference assessment or a reinforcer assessment in your strategies. You should be looking at what a student prefers and testing to see if those are actually going to be reinforcing for that student and that behavior. You're going to know it's reinforcing if you give it to the student and they keep engaging in that behavior. This is, again, big major behavioral principles that we can talk about another day, but it's really important to actually say, if you're going to say we're going to reinforce the student, how, make sure it matches that function. Everything from the FBA and the behavior plan should really align. Shouldn't have to have any guesswork. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the data collection. We discussed the measurable goal, and so we know that there will be some sort of measurement occurring already. So this might be measuring the frequency of that behavior, the duration, the rate, whatever makes sense to that behavior. Data collection is essential to this process and to the progress of the student. Many behavior plans will collect data on two pieces, the replacement behavior and the interfering behavior. You want to demonstrate that the replacement behavior is increasing, but you also want to see what is happening with that interfering behavior. Is it continuing to occur at high rates? So you might be having this replacement behavior that you taught and you're really pleased with, and they're starting to use it independently, but they're still engaging in that interfering behavior. So maybe it's decreased slightly, but it's still somewhat persistent. You need both pieces of information in order to make informed decisions about whether or not your plan is working. Ideally, your behavior plan will collect data on both pieces. It is a red flag if the behavior plan only focuses on decreasing a problem behavior and only collects data on that behavior. You need both pieces of information to ensure that the student is learning new skills and those skills are decreasing that problem behavior. Another way to think about the importance of data collection is to use an example from the medical field. Let's say you aren't feeling well. You make an appointment with your doctor. You go to the doctor. You typically expect them to take your temperature, your blood pressure, do an examination, and ask you some questions. All of that information is data for the doctor. Let's say you go to the doctor, none of that happens. You walk in the door, you go back into the exam room, and then your doctor comes in, looks at you and says, you know, you said you feel dizzy. I think it's your brain. So let's go ahead and schedule you for brain surgery next week. You would be pretty upset. I hope all of you would be. Don't go back to that doctor. Pretty upset that they made a bunch of assumptions about you without any data. That same science of data and investigation that we expect from medicine is what drives behavior change in education. We are always gathering and assessing data to inform our decisions. It's so crucial to the behavioral change process and to all of education that we collect and we assess and analyze data. A problem can occur when everyone becomes focused only on the problem behaviors and not considering the broader skills, the student's current repertoire of skills, the student's motivation, what's going on in their immediate environment, what's going on in their life, and other quality of life issues. So these need to be considered in the behavior plan and also within that IEP. The behavior plan should complement other goals in the IEP because it's a plan that is housed within that IEP or the 504 plan. For example, if a student is working on increasing his speech and language skills, then any communication goal within the behavior plan would also be incorporated within that speech program. If a student is being taught to tolerate difficult tasks, then ensuring that the student has adequate supports during those difficult tasks is vital. Understanding those strengths and needs will inform the behavior plan, and the resulting behavior plan should complement the IEP. If you notice a disconnect between them, that is something to discuss within the IEP meeting. For example, if difficult behaviors often occur during like a reading class or something, that you want to make sure whatever goals are in the IEP for reading, that those goals interact with the behavior plan with many of those antecedent strategies and prompting strategies probably being repeated in both. You also want to make sure that there are no contradictions within or between the IEP and the behavior plan. If the student struggles to tolerate waiting or delayed access and the behavior goal is to complete 30 minutes of class, that probably will not work out well. So you do want to look between the behavior plan and the IEP and 504 plan and make sure that the strategies in the behavior plan are not only feasible for the environments, that they support the other IEP goals and strategies. Since the behavior plan is ultimately a teaching plan, it should always relate to those skills and those strengths discussed within the IEP. Often there'll be repeating sections within there. If there's a certain strategy that's been really useful within the IEP, let's say for reading or for math, and the student struggles with problem behavior during that content area, those strategies should be in the behavior plan. It should reference that exact same strategy because they should complement each other and they should be working to coordinate with each other. I'm going to address some of the common issues with behavior plans over the next couple of slides here. The first common issue is that the behavior plan becomes just a formality. So in these cases, there's typically some problem behavior, it's somewhat disruptive, and the behavior plan is developed but not necessarily used or followed. So typically here, the FBA conducted uses mostly indirect data, a couple observations in there, but in general, it's more of an informal assessment versus that comprehensive FBA we discussed the last time I was on the webinar. The behavior plans in these cases typically focus on really very generic strategies and broad goals. For example, we are going to use a visual schedule and teach coping skills to the students. Typically, those plans don't include clear or specific teaching or implementation procedures as to how and why and who is going to be doing this. So if you see these plans as a parent, a practitioner, or an administrator, there is a solution. First, ensure that that comprehensive FBA has been completed, and if not, which it probably hasn't, make sure it's completed. Someone has to do it. The next piece is to really review the student's history and the data collected. What has worked in the past? What were prior goals and how were they taught? Were the goals reached? This information should provide clarity as to some directions to go in, and it will also allow the team to focus on the student's strengths and their interests in creating those individualized goals. If a student has shown no self-regulation skills, then having a goal that the student will increase self-regulation doesn't really help us or the student. What does help us is to have a specific goal individualized to that child's strengths and needs. So using self-regulation as an example, because this is a goal I see all the time, just increase self-regulation strategies. If a child consistently struggles with self-regulation when engaging in a perceived non-preferred academic work task or a content area that's difficult for the child, we should start targeting those self-regulation strategies in that environment, in that content area. Additionally, we can have the child practice those strategies outside of that situation to gain some practice and some fluency. So this leads to the next solution, which is really just systematic teaching and implementation. Who, what, where, when, and how. How are these things going to be taught? Who's teaching them? What are the materials they'll need? And where will that be happening? Is it in the content area? Is it outside of that? These are questions that need to be answered. And the teaching procedure should be so carefully laid out that every person on the team understands how that skill is going to be taught. Okay, here's another common problem, the let's do all the things kind of plan. So this problem is when the PBSP, the Positive Behavior Support Plan, becomes the catch-all for every single disruptive behavior the child exhibits. So in these plans, the teams try to focus on addressing everything, and so the plans become very convoluted and the strategies difficult to implement in practice. The solution here is you really just need to prioritize. What is the most concerning problem behavior? Is it the one that happens the least frequently? It is the most intense? It is a mild behavior that's happening, though, almost daily. For example, you might have a student who will hit himself in the head once every 3 weeks, but he'll go to shove another student every day. So which one is more disruptive or dangerous to your classroom? The team needs to choose one, and that needs to be where they focus their efforts. So then you do everything we've already mentioned in terms of developing a plan. Here you need to be very conscious of the data collection when there are multiple behaviors in play. Because while you're focusing your plan on one, you want to be collecting data on all of the others, because sometimes there is interference where strategies from one behavior end up affecting another behavior for good or for bad. So if it's the latter, you will probably want to revise those procedures or consider focusing your efforts on the other problem behavior. So while you're teaching that new skill, you have to continue to evaluate and assess those other behaviors. The last major problem that I often come across in terms of behavior plans is the one and done plan. So in this scenario, you had a great plan. It was initially effective at decreasing the problem behavior. However, the behavior has begun to stagnate, meaning that the disruptive behavior maintains, albeit potentially at those lower levels, and the replacement behavior is just not being consistently used. The plan, however, remains unchanged. Basically, initially effective is probably a good plan, but the behaviors have shifted. Potentially the function of the behavior has changed. Maybe the behavior is still receiving some reinforcement somewhere, or perhaps the replacement skill has just not been reinforced enough. Or perhaps the team just had tunnel vision and focused only on the problem behavior and failed to look more broadly at the student's current repertoire of skills and needs. There are many reasons why behavior plans end up stagnating. The solution here is to ensure that data is collected consistently, that it's reviewed consistently. I say this all the time, but behavior programming is a cyclical process. So a new FBA will need to be conducted to help evaluate what's going on. While it seems like you are starting over, you aren't starting from scratch here. You have a lot of information. You're armed with vital information about the problem behavior, and you already have some ideas about how to change it. You just need to do some tweaking about, particularly probably about reinforcement access and just making sure, is this behavior really functional enough for the student? If you take away nothing else from this webinar, please take away this little piece, which is that the goal of behavior programs is independence, not reliance on staff or submission to adults' wills. Independence is what we are working for, is what we are working towards. We want students to engage in behaviors that are appropriate, that are socially acceptable, so that they can be independent and involved in every community and activity that they choose. So the goal is not for students just to submit to what the teacher or the parent is saying that they should do. The goal is to bolster their skills and teach them to be independent. All right. I'm hitting the end here. I just want to take a minute to say that behavior change is really, really hard. There isn't just one strategy that works. It's not magic. It takes a lot of time and a lot of analysis, and it takes a lot of questioning to go back over those plans to make sure that they're effective. So don't be disheartened. It just takes a lot of effort.
Very good. That was excellent, Rachel. Very insightful and concrete. As usual, a lot of great questions from the attendees. So some are clarifications and others are just...
Okay.
One educator is asking, do we need parent permission to conduct an FBA for a student?
Yes. So the FBA is a permission to evaluate. So often if a student has an RR, they'll do an FBA if there's been any problem behaviors. And if your student does not have an IEP or a 504 plan, if you're asking for the FBA, because it is a permission to evaluate, chances are they're going to want to do a full evaluation. So yes, you need to get parent permission.
Mm-hmm. This is once again a clarification. So are you saying that a teacher, an educator, cannot put a behavior plan in place without conducting an FBA?
Yes.
Okay.
And part of that, and just to give a little bit of background about that, is because the FBA is where you're assessing all the variables. How can you put an IEP into place if you haven't looked at how that student is responding to instruction, how that student is responding and compared a discrepancy analysis with other peers? It's the same thing in behavior. You don't just slap a plan together because you're saying, okay, this kid's struggling in my classroom. I'm going to write up an official behavior plan of all the different things we're going to teach them. You need to have the answer to what's going on. What are the students' skill sets? What are the functions of this behavior? Because else you might be slapping together something that is not only not teaching them a new skill, but unwittingly also reinforcing the disruptive behaviors. That's not to say that you can't put in some antecedent strategies and trial a few things, trial a few strategies. But if your student has a disruptive behavior and it is impeding their learning or the learning of others in your classroom, you should go through this official process and do the FBA and do the positive behavior support plan. It's going to take longer, but you'll end up with a more comprehensive plan and strategies in place than just trying to pull together something random. As an example, I walked into a school once and they were just, putting weighted vests on kids who were getting upset. We just can't throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. We have to go through the process. It's going to take longer, but you'll get more information and you'll have a better result from that.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. A couple of parents have asked, what's the target age for behavior plans? Is it primarily elementary school aged kids?
Any kid can have a behavior plan at any age. I strongly suggest if you have a child or if you're a teacher and you have kids with disruptive behaviors at the elementary level, to get behavior plans in place. And the reason is because if they just seem mildly maybe disruptive at the elementary level, kids get bigger, kids grow up. So what can maybe be disruptive slightly with a kindergartner, imagine that behavior when the kid's 13. We have to take the opportunity to teach them now, to build those skill sets now. I get very disheartened when I get to middle schools and I'm talking to high school teachers or going and meeting with high school families, and they have kids who we could have nipped this in the bud in elementary school, but now we have a high schooler who's yelling and throwing things in the classroom. At that point, police can be involved. It becomes very restrictive, and that's not to scare people, but we really have to start this early. If your kid's in early intervention, they should be looking at their behaviors then, and then definitely at the elementary level. Don't wait on that, and make sure that it goes through this official FBA positive behavior support plan process.
Mm-hmm. A common misbehavior of kids with ADHD is blurting in the classroom. One parent is saying, how do you replace this behavior with a more appropriate one?
Do you say blurting?
Blurting, yes.
Blurting, yeah. I can't speak to a flyby consult to say this is the exact way to not do it, but sometimes it depends. Like usually when that happens, we might teach raising hands, you might teach writing it down and then having time in the classroom that they can say to a peer or to the teacher, hey, these are the comments I wrote down. I've had students who we have like Post-its on their desk of different colors. So when they're like feeling the urge, they grab it. And then if there's a co-teacher in the class or peer professional, they'll run over, or a peer buddy who's been assigned to turn and be like, oh, what do you want to say? And they have that conversation. So there's a couple of different ways to strategize that. And a lot of it will depend on the student, the makeup of the classroom, how frequently it's happening, and the age group. When you're looking at kindergartners, first, second, third graders, that's really common across peers. Sometimes I think we forget that, all kids do that. If you're looking at a 12th grader, that's a different story. We've expected a different level of behavioral control at that age.
One parent is asking, she's saying that her daughter needs breaks sometimes in class. The school put together a plan, without her agreement, by the way, that states if she takes too many breaks, the breaks are taken away. This parent is saying, I don't see how that helps or is positive in any way. What should she do?
I can't speak to the breaks because I don't know the student. What I can say is, first of all, the behavior plan should be made with your permission. So if that was made without that FBA, I think you should go ahead as a parent and request that and say, I want someone to do it. And I would request a licensed behavior specialist or a BCBA do that. So first and foremost, nothing should be done with your child's education without your permission. The second piece to that is this is something, I think that's a little bit of a broader question, which is I hear a lot of, well, why should that kid get to do that when these kids don't? And what's beautiful about special education is it's individualized. So we're working from where that kid is successful. For this individual child, I would say if they need 20 breaks in the class right now in order to be successful, that's okay. The key here is to have a plan to wean those out. So what skill is she being taught? Is it to appropriately ask for a break? It's to recognize in her body that she's starting to get squirrely or out of control or whatever that might be and needs to go take herself out of the classroom. So there's some of those pieces. As long as there's a plan for her to get that instruction so that she's not, thinking further ahead at a job and having to leave every day after 2 hours on the job, as long as there's a plan to help build tolerance for the classroom, to build tolerance and take those strategies that she's using on the break to the classroom, that's really the biggest piece. So to recap here, one, get an FBA done and have that be the basis for the behavior plan. And then make sure that you're questioning and talking to them about, well, what's the plan to get her back in? It's fine if you say she can't do 30 breaks, but we have to meet her where she is. So if 30 breaks is what she needs, 30 breaks is what she gets. The question is just, how are we going to taper that off? How are we going to measure success and progress? And it is a bit complicated procedure, but every behavior plan should include something about how is this going to be generalized and how are you going to fade out anything that's really contrived. I hope that makes sense.
Yes.
I'll be talking about it further.
Several parents have asked the same question. How are parents and teachers able to conduct an FBA or create a behavior plan while distance learning or learning remotely?
No, I know. Well, I'll say the FBA you can do remotely. So your school district, they'll have someone who does this, whether it's the teacher, behavior specialist, a contractor, whoever it is. If you can ask them to have an FBA conducted remotely, and what that looks like is you as the parent will just need to be comfortable with the video conferencing that someone's going to log in and watch, or you need to be comfortable videotaping sessions when there is problem behavior for that person to watch and record. And of course, the interviews and all of those components. So much like every other telehealth practice, we just need to see it and be able to get data from it. And so you can record it, or you can have a video conference like this set up for them. And so that's the way you can do the FBA. The behavior plan would be taken from that. Now, what's tricky about the remote learning is that with K through 12 school, so that section of IDEA, when it talks about behavior plans, is very specific that it is related to school and the education environment. When home becomes your education environment and you don't have people coming in from the school to facilitate that, this isn't homebound instruction, then that's being put on the parents or the caretaker, whoever is there. And so that's where lines can blur and it can become really tricky in terms of implementing those positive behavior support plans. So I might come up with a plan based off of a virtual FBA that says, these are the 10 things I would do. This is how I would teach it. This is what I'd want to teach. This is what the environment should look like. Give that to the teacher. The teacher gives that to you as the parent. But then it's up to you at that point to kind of say, is this feasible right now? Can I do this? And sometimes just the history of parents and children, it's really hard for them to suddenly become teachers and facilitators of a positive behavior support plan. So the long story short here is that you can do the FBA, the positive behavior support plan will come with recommendations. And at that point, if you're in a remote learning environment, it's really just up to what you as the facilitator or the caretaker feel comfortable doing and teaching. And we're just at a very difficult time in this particular topic in the world right now, and globally across education. This is a huge question in behavioral sciences of how are we helping these students who are struggling behaviorally at home during education when we don't have control over the education environment in the same way as they did at school. I will say you can take the plans they did at school, but they just might not be effective now. So ask the teacher, ask them to reconduct that FBA or to provide suggestions and materials. But we all have to be prepared that that might just not be enough. I know it's disheartening.
Mm-hmm. How do you suggest, this must be a school administrator or working on an IEP team, how do you suggest working with families to get them on board with the same replacement behaviors? In other words, similar consequences for new and old behaviors?
This is maybe a bit of a broader question because first it requires that there has to be trust between a family. There has to be a collaborative relationship building that's already occurred. And in problem behaviors, a lot of the time it can be difficult if a kid is really good at home, they don't have the same demands at home, and then is super struggling at school. So sometimes that already can have some mistrust there. But assuming that you have some collaborative relationship building, I feel like the biggest piece for me has always just been explaining why this relationship, why this behavior matches this function. So right now, for example, the kid is yelling and throwing things out of his desk and he's leaving the classroom. Peers are giving him a bunch of attention and laughing and all these things occur. So we might say is, all right, we'd like to replace that with some different communication devices, some different ways to communicate. Maybe it is a break. Maybe it's communicating, I need help. Maybe it's also ensuring that there's enough adequate academic supports in there. What I often find, here's a tangent, is that a lot of the times during the content areas, it's the fact that the student doesn't have the skills to meet that immediate content area demand. Mm-hmm. So we're asking them in physics to do something and that they're really struggling and we haven't given them the adequate academic support. So that's why they're engaging in all these problem behaviors. But what I would say is if you can explain all of that to them, then ideally families, I think, are usually on board if you can really rationalize, hey, this is a skill deficit that they have, and this is how we're meeting it. I've never had a discussion with a parent where I have said to them, when I've explained it in that way in terms of here are the deficits, this is what we're doing to meet this deficit so that your student will be independent and successful. I've never had someone turn away and say, well, we don't want that.
Right.
So I think, part of this is just about, are you specifying, and also have you done some assessments on the deficits of that student in terms of their needs so that you can really say numerically from this assessment, this is what we know they're missing and this is how we're addressing it.
Mm-hmm. Several parents also have asked about, in the data collection process, the kinds of external factors affecting a child at home or in life, like might be drugs or not have friends, and how that might be reflected in the classroom. Is there any way they can sort of ensure that in the data collection process that is factored in prominently?
I think the data collection process is usually pretty just black and white. It's about, okay, is this occurring, and what are some of the reasons? Is this occurring or isn't it occurring? However, I think this kind of goes back to the FBA process as well. The variables, you should be taking into consideration all those variables when you're making those plans. Now, if those variables you feel are like drug use, let's say, are really consistent, that you're saying, oh, if a kid's doing this, it's going to definitely affect their behavior in a day, then what you'll usually have on those data sheets are something, it might be a column that will have check boxes for, say, that says looks this way or came in and students did this. You should have enough information that on a data collection sheet, it will provide some of that sort of setting event structure for you. So you already know when you're coming in, you can mark out, yep, he punched a kid when he walked in the door, but it'll also say came in late, had his clothes were a mess. He seemed like he didn't wash. He didn't take a bath and his eyes were glazed. There could be that kind of structure. All of the data collection forms are individualized for the student. So there shouldn't just be one form that everyone hands out and fills out for a kid. If your kid has specific variables, environmental variables that are affecting them, peer variables, that would be reflected in the data sheet. And again, kind of going back to that conversation and collaboration between family and school, all of those variables should be known and discussed in the IEP meeting. And so when you look at that data sheet as a parent or an educator, you know that this is something that will address each of those pieces. And if it doesn't, you just have to tweak it. I mean, I feel like I make new data sheets, I feel like weekly. I'm making new data sheets for different kids. You just have to. This is, the beauty of special education. It's also time consuming, but it's what we do.
Yeah. Speaking of time consuming, there's an educator here who says many teachers feel their job is to teach and that data collection is too much for them to do while serving the other students. They feel it is unfair to dedicate time to this one student while the majority of students miss out from instruction. Who would you suggest should handle classroom behaviors? That's a tough one.
That's a tough one because I have a lot of empathy for general education teachers who have a class of 30 and have a lot of that they need to address with that class of 30. And if you're asking them to do 50 things for one. However, I do feel like schools are very good at providing supports for that. Does that student need a paraprofessional to come in and do the data for them? Is the data sheet too convoluted, kind of going the opposite direction now? Does it need to be something as, did this occur, didn't this occur? And something that the teacher could easily check off. So it doesn't have to be, here's 50 different boxes they need to check off. It has to be feasible for the teacher if it's going to be used. But within that too, if we don't have the data, then we're not going to know if the student's making progress. And then what's the point of even having a behavior plan? So yeah. To me, again, with teachers, we talk a lot about feasibility. Is this reasonable to expect from you? Can you do this type of plan or program? And if they can't, it's not, we don't do this program if we think it's the best. It's, well, then who can? Who comes in? Is it does the social worker come in and help? Do we have related service providers coming in and helping? Is there a para that's already in that room or a co-teacher that we could pull to kind of do these different pieces? And so I don't think it's about, sometimes these questions are about who. If you feel that the plan is sufficient and comprehensive and this is the plan the student needs, then somehow along the lines it's figuring out how to make it feasible for that teacher. I do think they can do this. I do think there's a lot of supports in schools to help teachers or to help the students, or whether it's paraprofessional or somebody else, come in and take that data. But you need the data. It's essential.
Right. Just sort of a simple question. Is there a certain amount of time that an FBA should take?
The PTE takes, once the PTE is signed, you have 30 to 60 days to do it. I always kind of recommend getting it done within the 30, because if you think about 60 days, you're saying a child is engaging in disruptive behaviors. So if you wait 60 days to get an FBA done, and let's say it takes another 2 weeks or a month to get that PBSP done, we've already missed out on 3 to 4 months of school. Right. So I always say, get the FBA done as soon as possible. Always, while you have 30 to 60 days, really talk to them about getting it done. Like, what's a reasonable timeline? And most people who are conducting those can get those turned around within the month. And sometimes also with parents and teachers, discussion of, like, let's really talk about a timeline, because teachers, they don't want to be just treading water with a student for 3 months. They need a plan too. So it benefits everyone to get it done as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. And I will say one more thing to that is what I've done when it has taken longer, if it's part of an RR, and so that potentially the ed psych is still working on those other pieces of the evaluation, we just had a meeting to discuss the FBA and got that jumped off. So it might be 3 weeks, and we'll have a meeting about the FBA, and then we're able to then get something into place while the ed psych is still working on the rest of the evaluation. Mm-hmm. So that's reasonable to expect too. Yes.
Are there any suggestions in a behavior plan that would work for a student who is experiencing school avoidance?
That's a little bit of a bigger question, because that has to do, I'm not going to answer like the strategies, because if it was just that easy, I'd be, have a book about it already. What I will say is that there are strategies in place for that. And a lot of that it's a combination of that sort of building factors of full assessment, where are their skills and where are their deficits. I've only known school avoidance when kids are really struggling academically. So how are we addressing them there? And then behaviorally, how are we giving them some control over their day-to-day and their lives and their schooling, while still providing those appropriate supports. So that's a really big question. I can, at another time, I'd be able to point to some resources, but there are resources for that. That's all I can say. Sorry, drive-by consults are hard to do about specific behaviors without knowing the case. Sure.
Do parents have the right to copies of the data that is collected for the FBA?
Yes. There's nothing. Parents have the right to anything with their child's, behavioral plan and education. So, if you want to look at how did you get these numbers in the FBA, ask for them. Say, I'd like to see the raw data. Or sometimes, like I've had instances where parents have just questioned, where did this number come from? And I explain all the different sources, and that should really be done in the FBA. Someone should be able to say, I collected the data from these 3 or 4 different sources using these 3 or 4 different methods over these different time period. Mm-hmm.
So, once getting into the 504 versus IEP, one parent is asking, even in a 504 plan, an FBA is required before a behavior intervention plan can be created? I would imagine so, right?
Yes. So my big thing about required is a gray area. Recommended, absolutely. And I say that always because, do you want to slap on something and hope it works? Or do you want to really know we have enough information to feel strongly confident that, 90% or above confident that this is the direction we want to go in? Too often people slap something together and it makes a little bit of difference. It might help for a little while, but it doesn't actually get to the core problem, which is, again, what are the skill deficits the student has, and what's the function of this behavior, and are we really addressing that function? Because if we're just telling a kid, and I see this a lot, which is the kids, yelling or throwing something to, let's say, get out of class, or that's what we assume. And people just say, well, they're not going to be able to get out of class. We're just going to keep them there. So, okay, so now they're not able to get out of class. So maybe it sort of gets a little bit better at some point, but it hasn't actually taught them a new skill. So then they go up to the next level in class. They're in a new classroom in a new year. It happens again. Let's say they do the same tactics, so putting little Band-Aids on, but they're not actually changing the behavior. And so I always want to be really careful about just to slap a behavior plan together without the FBA, because you need to make sure you are really teaching a replacement behavior that matches the function, or else you're just honestly making it harder for everyone in the long run, harder for that student, because again, they're going to be 15 years old and they're still going to be relying on these kind of same learned behaviors because they've been effective. They've been squashed down a little bit every year, but they're always going to rear their head every time you're in a new environment. And so you want to really get rid of them by teaching those new skill sets. And that just requires investigation. There wouldn't be an entire branch of science dedicated to assessing problem behavior if it was as easy as, let's just throw a visual schedule on it. Behaviors are complicated.
Yes.
Kids are complicated, and you need someone to analyze all those factors.
I agree. Yep. Well, I think the hour is up. Thanks so much for being here. You did an excellent job.
Happy to be here.
Very insightful, as I said. Practical suggestions. You did it all. So we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Everyone stay safe and have a great rest of your year.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thanks for everyone, all the attendees for attending, being here today. Please join us next week on November 5th when Kathleen Nadeau will talk about ADHD in older adults. Once again, thanks everyone for being here and have a great day.